Welcome to the latest in our series of International Legitimacy talks. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Richard Bellamy from University College London, who's going to speak a little bit about his book, A Republic in Europe of States. If we understand the current epoch as a crisis in legitimacy in some sense, particularly of transnational, supranational institutions, international institutions of which Brexit can be seen as symptomatic, commonly the responses we get are, okay, we should deal with this by either rewinding everything to the sovereign state, so we need to put states in the driving seat again, and really it has to be about state-based democracy, or we kind of throw out the state model and start talking about global democracy and democratizing international institutions, and we've had some discussions in this interview series about that. A classic example of this is a more muscular European Parliament, for example, sure, inculcating something like European parliamentary sovereignty. But your book doesn't do that. It tries to kind of strike a sort of third way between these two positions. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think that it can be legitimate if it meets two standards of what I call Republican intergovernmentalism. It's called Republican because the arguments are inspired by a sort of theory which has been brought to the fore. It's an old theory going back to ancient Rome, but it's brought to the fore by the Irish-Australian political philosopher Philip Pettit. And he argues that the core of legitimacy is not to be dominated by those who rule you or who can impact in various ways on your choices that you might make, either individually or collectively. And so one way in which one achieves this to some degree within states is if they have certain democratic credentials and certain social welfare credentials as well, so that people aren't forced into voting in a particular way. They have a certain amount of options. So as you say, one way of thinking about how you achieve that in a globalized world is to sort of shift it upwards to the global or to the European level. But my argument is that there are certain losses that arise from that. I mean, some of them are just the inevitable loss of scale. If you think that there are 750 odd MEPs in the European Parliament representing far more people than in any of the member states, there's a representative lost as a result of that. But there's also the loss of the different member states being able to make choices about how they develop their own economies and their democracies. So I've tried to sort of say, well, the big problem is, how can they not dominate each other when they make trade agreements, for example? How can they not dominate each other through restricting the choices that citizens in one state might have to move to another state? How can they not dominate each other by making domestic decisions which may have a huge impact externally? Mm-hmm. And one way is to sort of say, well, they can do this if they're all democratic states, all recognizing each other's status as democratic states, and they negotiate together. They try to come to mutual agreements which they see as sustaining their democratic systems. And sometimes if they can't make agreements, they allow certain opt-outs and so forth. And my view is that that's a better understanding of the achievements of the EU than the Euro-federal way of seeing it. Because I think that plays into the hands of those who are critical of the EU as imposing upon them. And I think that although there is a sort of ideological move among some pro-Europeans that see that as what it ought to be able to do, I think by and large, it hasn't done that. And so the book was an attempt to sketch an alternative way of understanding what it does and what it could do to the standard view.
Mm-hmm. Now, some of the proposals in the book, to a certain extent, require how should I put this, a softening of the status quo, particularly I'm thinking here in legal terms, in constitutional terms, with the doctrines of direct effect supremacy and so on. What could be a sort of a Euro-Federalist blueprint, we could say. What would you say to, we'll say, pro-Europeans who would say, look, these are necessary means to an end? For the project to get off the ground, we need some sort of coordinating authority, and any attempt to kind of undo that would cause unraveling of the project. Or who would say, look, these are necessary evils because political integration can't work without some sort of authority. Maybe is it time to take the stabilizers off, so soften constitutionalization in this sense, that we have evolved enough of a polity? Or what would you say to people who say it's too early to do that? I mean, if anything, if Brexit shows us anything, process, rule-based solutions from the EU side are what makes the EU work, right? We've seen that in the Brexit negotiations. And some people might think, okay, so this is what helps the EU do what it does. And to take that away, if we start politicizing it in a way that some of your proposals suggest, that this could lead to its unraveling. I mean, what would your position on that be?
That certainly isn't my intention. What I think, I mean, I'm very much in favor of the process. I mean, and of course, some European federalists want to simplify that, to have more majority rule, greater powers for the Commission and European Parliament, less for the European Council and so forth. So my argument is those processes are very important. I guess one of the proposals which might have fed into your comment is that there's a view very prominent amongst a number of European lawyers that law has to be uniform for all in order to be true law, as it were, the rule of law to prevail. And I think if one then looks at what happens within any complex polity, such as the United Kingdom, you find that none of this is true. I mean, obviously, in Scotland even has a different legal system to the rest of the UK. So one shouldn't expect full uniformity. There has to be a degree of flexibility in how these things are implemented, which is, as the treaties say they should do, respects the national constitutional traditions of the different member states. And one element of it might be that you have a demanding process, but nonetheless it exists, which allows member states to opt out of certain provisions, to roll back elements of the acquis. And I should say that I think that's important also to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the EU, because at present, because it's such a consensual organization, strong on lengthy processes, that means that there is quite a lot of things which are now treated as uniform compulsory law, which a lot of people, not just Eurosceptics, but many European federalists think are inefficient and not fit for purpose. So you need some way of dealing with that issue, which doesn't unpick the whole thing. And I see the current moves to what in the sort of current jargon is called differentiated integration are moves towards having a more flexible EU which responds to its economic and cultural heterogeneity, as well as it's the desire of many of the member states to retain control but remain within this structure.
But of course that flexibility would be purchased at the cost of a sense in which all member states are treated equally, right, and uniformly. So law can be uniform, it can be rigid, but it also can preserve a sense of equality, particularly among member states, that they are at least in principle equal, right? So we would have to manage that tension somehow.
Well, I mean, you know, when we sort of want to, there are two ways of treating people equally. One is to treat them exactly the same. But that is, we recognize that that can often be not to respect their important differences. So we have now in all public buildings access measures for people who have various disabilities, for example. And we see that as important for treating them equally. But they're not necessarily treated literally the same, but they're given, one appreciates the relevant differences. So one element of what I'm suggesting is that we respect those relevant differences. I suppose a more ambitious element is, well, what if it's just a collective choice of a particular country to opt out of a certain measure? How should we look at that? And there, you know, I've been working, this isn't in the book, but it's something which follows from the book that I've been thinking about. I think that it should be allowed so long as the other member states are not made worse off than they would otherwise have been, that it's a Pareto improvement, if you like, for as far. So that means that it may be better for a particular state, but it doesn't worsen the position. It may increase the inequality between them, but it doesn't, in absolute terms, worsen the positions of the other states. So I see that as one kind of norm that I might want to put on to avoid free riding and so forth.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the question we've asked all of our speakers, but with a slight twist. So we usually ask people Brexit, Trump, transnational governance, international institutions, currently the target's a lot of populist politics. And we usually ask our speakers, say, what do you think is happening now, right? Does this tell us about the future? Yeah. But what I wanted to ask you was rather, because part of your book, of course, deals with the questions of, is the time ripe to do this? There's a question of inertia in reform, and all these kinds of projects require some sort of initiative, some political initiative to get off the ground to make them happen. Do you think that the current state of politics in the West in particular, and attitudes to an international rules-based order, is conducive to a period of kind of root and branch reform in the way that some of these projects might like yours, take root?
Well, I mean, in a way, I'm putting forward something which is far less ambitious than many people would wish. So I kind of borrow both an approach and a phrase from the philosopher John Rawls, who talked about a realistic utopia. In other words, that it's significantly based in the status quo. It's not seeing the disappearance of member states or their role within the EU. On the contrary, it's about strengthening them to a degree. But it's also about retaining many aspects of the EU, such as freedom of movement, notion of European citizenship, and so forth. So, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I've been working on these issues since Maastricht and had a long period when I was viewed as sort of little more than a Brexiteer, as it were, before the term was
Avant la lettre. Yeah.
Avant la lettre, exactly. But whereas now, you know, I think one of the reasons which led me to finally put it all together as a book was I thought, oh well, maybe my moment has come, you know, and there will be more receptivity to it. Of course, sadly, too late for the UK. I mean, obviously, academic work rarely has much of an impact, but I do think that it's potentially reflecting a mood among that not everyone by any means, but I think there's greater receptivity, as I said, in the very fact that the term of the kind of moment is differentiated integration, suggests that there is some possibility for some elements of what I'm suggesting to become a reality. I hope so, anyway.
Professor Bellamy, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.